On a narrow street in the little village of Herkimer, New York, there is a plain brick building at 78 Harter Street. If you had stood in front of it on a summer morning in 1952, you would have heard it before you saw it. The high, insistent whine of small engines being run in on test stands, one after another, hour after hour. Inside that building, men and women were finishing more than 1,000 engines a day. Not 1,000 a week, 1,000 a day. For a stretch of years in the 1950s, this small brick shop in a town most Americans could not find on a map was, by one collector's reckoning, the largest maker of model engines in the world. And today, almost no one remembers that it existed at all. And the engine that made it famous was small enough to disappear inside a boy's closed fist. They called it the OK Cub, a glow engine the size of a thimble, the 0049. It cost a few dollars, it bolted to the nose of a balsa airplane, and when you flicked the little propeller and it caught, it filled the whole backyard with a flat, snapping, ear-splitting song and the sweet chemical smell of its fuel. For a generation of American boys, that little engine was the first machine they ever truly owned. Here is what almost nobody remembers now. Before there was a Cox, before the famous Cox Babe Bee became the first engine of practically every American boy, there was the OK Cub. It came first. Years before Cox built its own 0049, Herkimer was already making them by the hundreds of thousands. The company that Cox is remembered for beating had already invented the thing Cox got famous for, and then it vanished. By 1964, the engine stopped, not because the little Cub failed, not because a bigger, richer company crushed it in open combat. Something quieter than that. Something that started as the best business deal the company had ever signed. There is one more thing to hold on to, all the way to the end. Somewhere in this story is a small cardboard box. A box that let a 10-year-old boy do something no rival ever let him do, and then say 4 words out loud that meant the whole world to him. I will come back to that box right before the end. Because to understand how a company making 1,000 engines a day disappeared, you first have to understand the man who never meant to make engines at all. His name was Charles Brebeck, and in 1937 he was not a maker of toys. He was a fixer of trucks. Born in 1893, Brebeck ran a shop in Herkimer called the Interstate Bearing Company, rebuilding the rear axles and brakes of automobiles and trucks. And by every account, he was one of the finest rebuilders in the state. He was a machinist to the bone. A man who understood metal and heat and tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, in an age when most repair work was done by feel. For more than 15 years, trucks and brakes were the whole of his working life. Honest, invisible work. And it taught him the one thing that would matter more than anything else: how to make a small steel part so fine that it would hold up under heat and speed and years of hard use. In 1937, his son changed the course of the family. Charles Brebeck Jr., 20 years old, brought home a friend's broken model car engine and gave it to the one man he knew could fix anything with moving parts. His father sat down at his bench and studied it, and somewhere in that studying, something turned over in his mind. He had been looking for a product of his own, something to build and sell under his own name instead of forever repairing other men's machines. He did not copy the engine on his bench. He designed his own. And in 1938, Charles Brebeck Sr., his son, and a partner named Harry Bliss founded the Herkimer Tool and Model Company. The brand stamped on the engines was just 2 letters: OK. There is a detail here that tells you exactly who these men were. When they chose the size of their very first engine, a big point. 6. Oh, they chose it for one plain reason. It was the size that fit the machine tools they already owned. They built the engine the factory could build. That is a shop man's decision, not a marketer's. And it is the first quiet seed of everything that came later. This was a company built around its machines, around what the factory floor could physically do better than anyone. That strength is the very thing that would one day become the trap. Picture the shop floor in those first years. It is small. This is not Detroit, but it runs like something much larger. The air carries the smell of cutting oil and the sharp tang of aluminum being turned on a lathe. And underneath everything, the whine of finished engines being run in on the bench. Because before an OK engine was ever boxed, it was clamped down, fueled, started, and held wide open for a few screaming minutes so that a man could listen to it and know for certain it was sound. Multiply that by hundreds a day, and you understand the sound that hung over Harter Street. Every part made in-house. Every engine tested by hand. That insistence was the source of all their quality and all their pride. It is also, quietly, part of the reason the trap that was coming would close so completely. Through the war years, the company hardened. It built a small twin engine for a military target drone, holding to standards no hobby shop would ever demand. And it learned under real pressure how to make thousands of identical, reliable engines on a schedule, while Brebeck patented his ideas as he went. So when the war ended and the boys came home and started families, and those families started buying hobby kits in numbers America had never seen, Herkimer was standing in exactly the right place, with exactly the right skill in its hands. And for a little while, that is the most dangerous thing a company can ever be, perfectly suited to the world as it is, right before the world quietly changes. You already know this little shop made engines. What you probably do not know yet is that it was about to make more of them than anyone in the world, and that the single decision that ended it years later was not the one everyone assumes. If stories like this one matter to you, take 1 second and subscribe. But stay with me. Because to understand how far this company fell, you first have to see how impossibly high it climbed. The turning point arrived in the summer of 1949, when Herkimer introduced the OK Cub. It was, as the model aviation world would later describe it, the first real mass-produced 049, cheap enough for a boy's allowance, reliable enough to actually start, and small enough to power the light control line airplanes sweeping across American backyards. And understand, it was not a toy. It was a real internal combustion engine, small enough to sit in a teacup, burning methanol and castor oil inside a cylinder you could cover with a thumbnail. To start one, you primed it and flicked the propeller with a quick, committed snap of the finger, and it either caught and screamed to life or it bit you. There was no soft version of it. Herkimer had it. Herkimer had it first. If you pulled a model airplane kit off the shelf in that era, you could almost count on seeing an OK Cub drawn right there on the nose in the artwork. It became the default, the engine that came bundled with the whole idea of an American boyhood. And here is the seed hiding inside that triumph. The Cub sold on price and on volume. Pennies of profit, multiplied by an ocean of units. It is a magnificent position to hold, and a terrible one to defend. Because the moment somebody arrives who is cheaper, and just as big, your entire advantage can evaporate in a single season. By 1952, the little building at 78 Harter Street was turning out more than 1,000 engines every single working day. A finished, tested, boxed engine roughly every minute, day after day, in a village in the Mohawk Valley. By the end of 1953, Herkimer had sold more than 1 million engines. The company had 700 distributors and more than 4,400 dealers putting OK engines on shelves across the country. Their advertisements ran in every magazine a curious boy or his father might pick up. Air Trails, Model Airplane News, Boy's Life, Popular Science, Popular Mechanics. The strategy was as simple and as total as it sounds. Make sure that every boy in America grew up already knowing the name OK. For a stretch of years in the mid-1950s, one collector history claims, Herkimer was the single largest manufacturer of model engines in the world, with more than 2 million OK engines made from the very beginning. Whether it was truly the largest on Earth is the kind of thing collectors argue about. That it was one of the giants is beyond argument. It had one of the most complete lines the hobby had ever seen. Little diesels that ran on compression alone, glow engines in every size, racing engines built for international competition, a tiny quarter-size 024 so small it seemed impossible that human hands had assembled it. And Brebeck kept cutting deals that put his engines exactly where the boys already were, even supplying a special Cub as the exclusive engine for Jim Walker's popular ready-to-fly plane, the Fire Baby. Wherever model flying was happening in America, Herkimer was the engine humming underneath it. Now let me talk to you directly for a moment, because if you are the right age, this next part is not history, it is memory. If you were a boy in America in the 1950s or early 1960s, there is a very good chance the first engine you ever held was an OK Cub. If you ever knelt on a driveway next to your father on a Saturday morning, and he showed you how to prime the little engine and flick the propeller, and it kicked to life and very nearly took the skin off your knuckle, you know exactly the thing I am describing. And if that fuel smell, methanol, and castor oil can still put you back on one specific lawn 60 years ago, then understand that the smell came from Herkimer, New York. That little brick building made the first machine a boy was ever allowed to own and start and be responsible for. A rite of passage a father could buy his son for a few dollars. And here is a statement that will sound strange, and it is completely true. The company that taught America how to put a cheap running engine into the hands of a 10-year-old was destroyed by exactly that idea, carried one step further by somebody else. But in 1953, none of that shadow had fallen yet. Charles Brebeck stood at the very top of an industry he had partly invented, his name stamped on more than 1 million running engines. It is the oldest shape of story there is. It rises like that, and it looks permanent, right up until the moment that it isn't. One decision changed everything. And it did not look like a disaster when it was made. It looked like the biggest opportunity the company had ever seen. In the 1950s, a new idea swept through the model airplane business: ready to fly. For decades, a model plane had been a project you spent weeks building. Now, companies began selling planes already built, engine and all. On its face, this was wonderful news for Herkimer, but the market changed its shape. It stopped being 1,000 small hobby shop sales and started being a handful of enormous contracts with the companies that assembled the planes. One of the biggest was a company called Comet. Comet needed a reliable, cheap engine to hang on the nose of plane after plane, and Herkimer, the low-price king who could make 1,000 engines a day, was the natural supplier. It started as exactly the kind of deal any business on Earth would want. Now, if you are watching this and thinking it is just a story about an old brand you half remember, stay with me for the next few minutes. Because what happened to Herkimer is the same trap that swallows good companies in every decade, including this one. The trap of the one enormous customer. You have almost certainly watched it happen to a business you knew, whether or not you ever had a word for it. The Comet business grew until it was taking up a larger and larger share of everything the factory could produce. Herkimer had climbed to the top of its world by selling to an ocean of small buyers, not one of whom could ever hurt it. And now, quietly, without anyone quite deciding it, the company was becoming dependent on one. Then, in the early 1960s, came the decision that broke the company. The villain in this story is not a cackling tycoon. It is a company and a deal. The ready-to-fly market was getting harder, and Comet was running into financial trouble. The cautious thing, seeing a big customer begin to wobble, would have been to pull back. Herkimer did the opposite. According to the model engine historian who has documented this company most carefully, Herkimer agreed to supply Comet with tens of thousands of engines on consignment. On spec, Herkimer would build the engines, ship the engines, and only get paid when the finished planes those engines were bolted into were sold. Not when Comet received them. When the end customer bought them. Someday. Off of some shelf. Somewhere. Read that back slowly. Real aluminum, real steel, real labor. Poured out the company's own front door on the promise of being paid later. If and when someone else managed to sell the planes. The entire risk had quietly slid across the table and come to rest on Herkimer's side of it. And then Comet collapsed. The planes did not all sell. The money did not come back. Herkimer was left holding an enormous, uncollectible debt, the full cost of tens of thousands of engines it had built and shipped, and would simply never be paid for. It very nearly bankrupted the company outright. To survive it all, Herkimer had to shrink hard and gut what it had spent 25 years building. And then, in the middle of the wreckage, the company lost the one thing it could never replace. In April of 1963, Charles Brebeck died at 69. He was the designer who had drawn every engine and held every patent, and he was the salesman who had put OK engines in every boys' magazine in America. When he died, at the exact moment the company was reeling from a debt that had nearly killed it, there was no one left who could do the two things the founder had always done alone. And there was one more thing, coming from the outside, closing in the whole time. Out in California, a company called Cox Manufacturing had finished its own first 0.049, the space bug, in the early 1950s, years after the Cub had already conquered the market. Cox was late, but Cox was relentless. In 1956, Cox introduced the Babe Bee, a 0.049, just like the Cub, but die-cast aluminum, engineered for staggering volume, and priced at $3.95. It was, in the words of the people who later chronicled these engines, the final nail in the coffin for a whole crowd of competitors. Cox had taken Herkimer's own idea and pushed it exactly one step further than Herkimer could follow. So look at the shape of it. From the inside, the Comet debt had gutted the company. From above, the founder was gone. From the outside, Cox was eating the very market Herkimer had created, one $3.95 engine at a time. Any one of those blows, alone, might have been survivable. All three together were not. Now, I want to be honesty with you about a part of this story, because the people who made these engines deserve honesty. I cannot tell you how many of them lost their jobs when Herkimer shrank. The numbers were never recorded anywhere that I can find. What I can tell you is this: 1,000 finished engines a day is not a machine doing that alone. That is human hands, at lathes and drill presses and assembly benches, in a small town where a steady factory job was the whole difference between a comfortable life and a hard one. When the company nearly went bankrupt and had to shrink, those jobs are what shrank. And a man who has spent 20 years learning to fit a crankshaft so a tiny engine runs true does not carry that skill on any diploma. It lives in his hands. When a shop like that hollows out, the The machines can be crated up and sold. The hands cannot. That knowledge went home at the end of a shift that turned out to be one of the last, and it aged, and it went quiet. That town did not lose a toy company. It lost the thing it had been the best in the world at. And here is the part that is hardest to sit with. The decision that killed the company was not a stupid one. Put yourself in Charles Brebeck's chair in the late 1950s. Ready to Fly is clearly the future. Comet is a huge account. Turning down a giant order would have meant handing that business straight to a competitor, maybe even to Cox. And the whole company had been built around one principle: keep the machines running, keep the volume up, be the biggest and the cheapest. The arithmetic holds right up until the assumption underneath it fails. The logic was defensible. The spreadsheet was not insane. But no spreadsheet in that room had a line on it for the machinist on Harter Street who would be out looking for work within a few years. That is the part the arithmetic could never measure. And it turned out to be the only part that was real. So what should we make of Cox, the company that won? Cox faced the very same forces and came out alive. But notice the difference. Cox built its own ready-to-fly line under its own name, the Thimbledrome Cars and Planes, and controlled its own product and price from one end to the other. It did not bet its survival on financing another company's inventory. Herkimer, the pioneer, tied its fate to a promise made by somebody else. Cox, the latecomer, kept its fate inside its own hands. The same storm blew over both. They made opposite decisions. They got opposite endings. The Cox 049 became the most popular engine of its kind in the world, still being made into the 1990s, long after the last OK engine had gone silent. So when people say the OK Cub simply lost to Cox, they are telling you the easy version, and the easy version is wrong. Herkimer did not lose to a $3.95 engine. Herkimer did not lose because its founder grew old and died. Herkimer lost to a handshake. Tens of thousands of engines shipped out its own front door on a promise, to a partner who collapsed before the promise could be kept. It was not beaten in the open market. It gave its own product away on credit. And the credit came due, and there was nothing left to pay it with. By 1964, it was over. The engine stopped. The little Cub 049, the one that had started it all in 1949, was among the last things the company offered before the line went quiet. 15 years, from the first mass-produced 049 to the last. There is a strange and gentle epilogue. A grandson, Ted Brebeck, gathered up thousands of OK engines from the wreckage of Comet's collapsed inventory and kept the name alive under new companies, reissuing old designs now and then. And here's the detail I find hardest to forget. The company that built America's first mass-produced model airplane engine eventually stopped making engines altogether and, under a later name, turned to making little model railroad passenger cars. Collectors who followed the name say it finally closed for good in 2020, more than 80 years after Charles Brebeck first sat down to study his son's friend's broken little motor. Today, the OK Cub survives where all of these things survive. In shoeboxes, in garage drawers, on the folding tables at swap meets, laid out on felt cloths, some still in their little boxes with the 2 letters printed on the side, and in the hands of the men who were once those boys, now in their 60s and 70s, telling each other exactly where they were standing the first time they ever started one. These engines have outlived the company by more than half a century, and a good one, cared for, will still start and run today, and make that same flat, snapping, unmistakable song it made in 1955. And that is exactly the place where something honest is worth saying. If you have an old OK Cub in a drawer somewhere, or any of these little American engines, a Cox, a Fox, a K and B, a McCoy, you may not know what it is worth now, or that telling a good original from a tired one comes down to a few things most people never think to check. That is what the first volume of the Collector's Vault is for, the field guides I put together for this channel. And I will be straight with you. YouTube turned the ads off on this channel, so those guides are the only thing keeping it running. The link is in the description, and there is a one-page card if you just want the short version. But stay with me, because I promised you something at the very beginning, and I want to give it to you now. Remember the cardboard box. In August of 1950, at the very height of its rise, Herkimer sold something it called the OK Power Kit, a Cub 049, taken completely apart. Every piece machined and finished at the factory, then packed into a box unassembled. All a boy needed was a screwdriver and a wrench. He would sit at the kitchen table and, with his own two hands, put the engine together, piece by piece. Then he would prime it and flick the propeller, and it would roar to life. And when it caught and screamed and filled the room, he could look up at his father and say 4 words that Cox, for all its cheap and perfect factory-built engines, never once managed to sell to anybody. I built my own engine. That is the thing this company understood, all the way back in 1950, the thing the winners eventually forgot. It was never really about the engine. It was about the boy holding it and what he got to become for one afternoon. There are more stories like this one. American things, built by hand, in small towns, by people who were the best in the world at some narrow and beautiful thing, and who are almost entirely forgotten now. Subscribing is what helps these stories find the people who still care about them. And if you are the kind of person who would rather keep a thing like this alive than watch it disappear, you already know what to do. But before you go, there is one last place I want to take you. Stand in front of 78 Harter Street in Herkimer, New York. Close your eyes. It is a summer morning in 1952. The building is alive. The whine of 1,000 little engines being run in, one after another, filling the whole street with their thin, high, endless song, and the sweet smell of the fuel drifting out through the open doors. Now, open your eyes. It is a quiet brick building on a quiet street, and almost everyone who walks past it has no idea that the loudest and proudest sound this town ever made once came pouring out of those doors 1,000 times a day. They built the first one, and being first turned out to be the only thing the world never gave them credit for.